How many of you were over at the Broadway at the screening at 10? Oh, fantastic. Thank you guys so much for coming to that and for coming here. It's been our pleasure. Our greatest pleasure is being able to share this film with patients and family members. And we were incredibly nervous the first time we showed it to a room full of patients, wondering like, oh my goodness, did we get it right? How many of you were over at the Broadway at the screening at 10? Oh, fantastic. Thank you guys so much for coming to that and for coming here. It's been our pleasure. Our greatest pleasure is being able to share this film with patients and family members. And we were incredibly nervous the first time we showed it to a room full of patients, wondering like, oh my goodness, did we get it right? And when we heard sniffling halfway throughout, or a few laughters rippling around, we're like, oh, okay, good. I think this is connecting. So we still enjoy bringing awareness and education. And then my personal perspective is just as the daughter of a fibromyalgia patient, and sort of my journey of trying to understand my mom's illness, and how when I look back in retrospect, some of the attitudes I'm a little embarrassed about that I had for a while about my mom's illness. And I love hearing from patients, but I love hearing even more from family members who say, thank you, I feel like I understand my wife, my mother, my husband, my brother, etc. better now, because I think that support network is so crucial. So the talk I've prepared today is what fibromyalgia taught me. And I'll start by telling you a little bit about how our family met fibromyalgia. As I'm sure many of you know, fibromyalgia is not a very welcome guest when it comes, and you might not even know that you've invited this guest somehow. But I met fibromyalgia when my mother was diagnosed. I actually met it about 5 years before she was diagnosed, but none of us knew that's what she actually had. I was actually talking to Dr. Drescher and Linda last night, and they were trying to ask me exactly when she got diagnosed. And I honestly have a hard time remembering, because there's just this long period of time that I just remember her not being well. Not well in a very profound way. Not well in a way where some days she couldn't get up the stairs from the kitchen to her bedroom. She would actually sometimes be crawling up the stairs. And I look back and wonder, how did we not start panicking and freaking out earlier than we did when your mom is crawling up the stairs to get to bed? And yet somehow I think family members can get used to this. And you can start to somewhat tune out the litany of complaints that you've started to just get used to hearing. And you just sort of think, well, mom's not well. And we will adjust our family dynamic around that. For those of you who saw the film, you saw that my mom was an extremely high-achieving person for most of the time that I've known her, and from the stories I hear before that as well. She was definitely a super athlete, a super mom, a very high achiever. She could juggle 20 balls at once and do it better than anybody could have done one individually at the same time. And so looking back, it really makes me wonder even more, so how did we not panic earlier about what was going on? When she finally did get diagnosed, it was an orthopedist who asked her, how long have you had fibromyalgia? And as she said in the film, she said, fibromy what? And he said again, fibromyalgia, and she said, I'm sorry, I don't know what that is. And then eventually she went back to her primary care physician, who at this time she was seeing somebody at Kaiser. And if there's anybody who represents Kaiser in the room, I apologize. I know that there are good experiences out there. And he said, well, yes, I've had that in your file for a few years now. But he was somebody who didn't believe in fibromyalgia and felt that to give her that word would just enable her as a hypochondriac or something like that. And so that was incredibly infuriating to look back and realize that helpful information that our family could have dealt with earlier was withheld because of prejudice and bias and a God complex, I would say. Fibromyalgia was just one of those things that we just gradually got used to, the unexplained pain and fatigue that wouldn't go away. And I know there's a host of other symptoms that many of you could talk about as well, but these were the predominant things for our family, was the pain and fatigue that she saw. And as I made reference to, it was very difficult for us to be empathetic, mainly because fibromyalgia is this peaks and valley condition. And so sometimes she would seem fine. And then when she wouldn't seem fine, I know occasionally we would look for things like, oh, maybe she just didn't want to do that today. And we would sort of notice patterns that weren't there. But it can just be very, very difficult for us to accept something that is chronic and cyclical. It doesn't look like what we're used to understanding. We're used to a diagnosis, and here's the plan of treatment, and there's the end goal. And fibromyalgia doesn't look like that, and we had a really hard time as family members understanding that. And as I mentioned, the dismissive, skeptical attitudes my mom sometimes faced in the medical industry was extremely difficult. I started going to medical appointments with her after she actually got the diagnosis. I started going with her to take notes for her because she was having a difficult time remembering sometimes, as well as to make sure that she asked the questions that she had wanted to ask, because we all know how it can be when you have like 5 or 10 minutes tops and you're trying to get these things in there. So I would sort of help be an advocate. And I remember one doctor in particular who, the moment she mentioned, I also have fibromyalgia, what do you do to help your patients who have that? And he said, well, my fibromyalgia patients, I have a psychiatrist who I recommend that they see. I was like, oh, great. Okay, we're not going back to see this doctor, Mom. This one isn't going to be helpful. And I'm trying to know if I can remember the exact day that Stephen and I, and this is my husband sitting right here, he's the one who actually had some filmmaking experience, I'm an English teacher, realized that we could make what we hoped our family could have started out with. He's very much a visual learner, and he loves to order a documentary or something or watch a program on TV, just to sort of give himself a general idea of something. And he was really frustrated that there was nothing like this that he could find for fibromyalgia. We had books that we had ordered. Of course, we'd all had done our internet searching, and that can be it's more hit than miss these days. But back then it was definitely more hit and miss. You could find all sorts of crazy stuff out there, things that didn't help our belief as family members sometimes as well. And he sort of said one day, we could make this. That you're crazy, there's no way. And the more we talked about it, the more we thought, well, maybe we could. And so that started a 2-year process of sort of educating ourselves, meeting different fibromyalgia patients. The National Fibromyalgia Association was incredibly helpful for this. We met with their staff and told them that we would like to do something that was story-oriented, something that family members and friends could sort of just sit down, and it's not going to be exhaustive, but just get a baseline introduction. But most importantly, just really get the empathy going, where they could see other people's stories and maybe enter other people's lives for a short while, and hopefully that would have the ripple effect of helping them understand their own family situation. And so we ended up, about 2 years later, the very end of 2006, coming out with Living with Fibromyalgia, A Journey of Hope and Understanding. And that subtitle was very important to me too, because it was definitely for me a way of understanding my mom better, and of having hope that it doesn't necessarily always have to be a dark day, that there is always hope. And my mom, I was a little nervous about what she might think about this. Not all of us necessarily want a camera on some of your more dark moments. And she was, besides being incredibly supportive because she's an amazing mom, she actually was honored that we were interested enough to try to learn a little bit more. And she's so hilarious. She actually just wrote me yesterday and said, I need 2 more copies. We send her copies all the time because she's always just giving them out to people, like, oh, my neighbor, and oh, I found out somebody at church needs this, and she's like the biggest evangelist out there. Sorry, I'm getting behind my bullet points here. The biggest thing is I remember looking back at a timeline of how quick I thought this project could be. I think I had a 3-month turnaround time in my head. And yeah, 2 years later is when it actually happened. My husband, I think, kept some of that information from me because he knew I would never want to do this project if I knew how much work it would be. But really, it was the incredible trust and access that the patients who participated gave us that turned it into the project that it came to be. So I'm here to tell you about some of the lessons I learned from fibromyalgia. And these apply far beyond the fibromyalgia setting. These are lessons that I try to incorporate in my own life, and especially the more I learned about how fibromyalgia might have genetic tendencies, I realized in some ways this was really smart of me to get a little educated in advance, because my mom and I actually are really similarly wired physically. We have some of the same sort of sensitivities, and we're both really sensitive to sleep and things like that. And so the more I started to learn about this, I said, well, maybe I've given myself a little dose of prevention before I go down that same road. One of the biggest things I learned is that our culture does not understand chronic cyclical pain. I can't tell you how many patients told me that, as strange as this sounds, I wish I had cancer. I wish I had something that nobody questioned, and it had an end date. I either was going to recover or it would be over, but I wouldn't have this constant cycle of not knowing what tomorrow might bring. And our culture, from our medical establishment, that seeps through to every aspect of life, does not understand these types of conditions. And it's not just fibromyalgia. Anything that's chronic and cyclical like this, we just don't really have much patience for. We can sit around for a short while and help somebody get through breast cancer or something. We'll all go walk and we'll raise money and we'll do things like this. But fibromyalgia doesn't go away. We definitely can manage it in better ways. But somebody asked me after the screening, who wasn't going to be able to come here, she said, "Do you have a cure rate?" And I said, well, I don't think you'll hear people use the word cure in dealing with this. They will say better, or as Lynn talked about in the film, they often feel like they've gotten to a particular side of it where they still might have it, but they feel like they understand it in a way they didn't before, and it isn't necessarily the controlling dominant force in their life. But you're not going to hear somebody talk about a cure in that way. And that's not something our culture understands. We get overwhelmed knowing how to support somebody in our life in that situation. Our culture does, though, understand stories, especially if we see it on the big screen or on TV. This is not something I necessarily thought about when we decided to make the film, but in the feedback I've gotten from patients and family members since then, I've realized how validated they feel just thinking that somebody took the time and expense to do something like this about their life, their condition. We definitely validate and understand things that make it to that level. And so I would encourage you as patients or as family members, you don't necessarily have to teach somebody all about fibromyalgia, but if you share your story, you'd be amazed at how far stories go. We're still empathetic at our core. This has been the most rewarding thing to me, is when a family member will write, or the patient will write to tell me about their family member that's had a breakthrough because of seeing the film. Patients are definitely an audience, but for me, being a family members were probably an even bigger priority audience for us, simply because I know how much easier things were for my mom once we all got on board with things. And once we stopped sort of suspiciously watching and be like, well, I actually think she walked okay from the car this time. It's embarrassing to I remember having a conversation with my sister and brother-in-law about the times we actually had seen her looking okay and what was going on at the time she wasn't. This was a quote that somebody told us after the very first time we ever showed this film to patients. This is actually, she left me a phone message. She said, the film was amazing. You did definitely accomplish your goal of bringing awareness, understanding, and hope to me and my family. My brother, for the first time, and I've been diagnosed since 1993, realized that I wasn't crazy and that this was real and I wasn't a drug addict. It was definitely life-changing for my family and for me. And whatever ways that our film or other things like this out there, there's a lot more advocacy work going on. If ever family members can have this change of perspective, I think it's so powerful for the entire family dynamic, but especially for the patient. Because if you're not believed in your own home, it's hard enough outside the four walls of your house, but in your own home, you need that sanctuary of belief. And patients felt really validated, too, as I mentioned, seeing their story. This is a woman from Virginia. She said, "I saw the DVD yesterday. I can't tell you how much it affected me in a positive manner. While watching it, I couldn't help but think, hey, they're just like me. As a result of watching the DVD and getting useful information from the local fibromyalgia support group, I can finally accept this illness after being diagnosed close to 20 years ago. I've ordered the DVD to share with my family and friends so they can hopefully see that I, for the most part, I do pretty well. But I will have bad days, and that is okay. I think viewing Living with Fibromyalgia may have changed my life. Thank you." She's great, actually. We keep in touch by email, and she is doing. This was about 2 years ago almost that she sent me this, and she still is doing really well. That part about acceptance, somebody was just chatting with me outside, is a big part of it. And there's several people in the film who talk about this. Linda Farwell was one of them. Who she has this grace and dignity about her life. She used to be a long-distance cyclist. She would take these crazy, like, she'd probably go, like, watch one of these extreme sports things over here. She would take these crazy bike tours where she would go to Europe, and I like to go to Europe and, like, sit at the cafes and go to the museums maybe and watch the world go by. She would take these trips where she was doing, like, 100-mile a day across Ireland and, France and things like that. So she went from this perspective on this is what it means to be happy and successful to actually now she's unable to hardly bike at all, only very occasionally. But she has accepted her life changes with a grace that has actually made many of those changes surprisingly positive. One of the biggest things I learned is ignorance is not bliss, both for you and family members, which is why things like this are so great. I probably don't have to elaborate on that one too much more to convince you of this point. Knowledge is power, and I think this is possibly more true for family members than it is for patients. And fibromyalgia is still one of those conditions where every now and then my mom will send me some email she's gotten or a website she's found that's some sort of miracle cure-all for fibromyalgia. And we tried a few of those at the beginning. And in fact, Linda, the same woman I was just referencing, said at some point she had an entire cabinet full of all of the miracle cure-alls she had bought, hoping that one of them would work. And she was spending many hundreds of dollars a month on this before she realized that it was not going to happen that way. And so knowledge is power, I think, not just from a emotional, psychological standpoint, but probably from a financial standpoint as well when it comes to knowing a little bit more about what's out there. My mom likes to remind me that it was 11 years ago that she had more than 11 years ago now, that she had the fall that sort of is the pinpoint that we can say. When I look back in retrospect, she was always somebody who was sort of predisposed to some of these symptoms. I'm sure many of you would recognize this, where she was just very sensitive to noise or crowds or stimulus. She definitely had irritable bowel syndrome for as long as I can remember. We had always had a difficult time going to restaurants and not having her have to spend the whole night upset about that. There's a famous story about the first Thanksgiving when my parents were married, and my dad made Thanksgiving dinner, and he made a dish that apparently had my mother at the toilet for about the next 2 days straight. It wasn't a good start to their holiday ritual traditions as a newly married couple. So she's in retrospect, she had a lot of these symptoms, and actually when we look back now, her mom did too. Her mom was always somebody, my grandma, who would just sort of go through these periods where, 3, 4, 5, 6 days at a time, she just couldn't be disturbed. Light would hurt her, sound, noise, and it was one of those things where I think for, particularly in that culture, this was in the South, where my mom's family is from, large family of 21 in West Virginia. Sometimes we just accepted that particularly women, just sometimes they would, at an age where now I would think like, well, this is like prime of life, but sometimes we just say like, well, they're unwell, and that's all you do to it. And that's what happened with my grandma. She was, of course, never diagnosed, and but my mom was, but it took a very long time. And she is now doing much better, but it took over 11 years of bad or worse news before there was any light at the end of that tunnel. And paradoxically, it is in giving up control that we gain it again. And this is something that I have learned that's true far beyond fibromyalgia. Our culture is definitely something where we really need a lot of control often. Lynn Matayana in the film talks about this as one of the things that she learned and that she always advises to other fibromyalgia patients is when your health does suffer, you find out that you aren't in control. And that can be extremely disturbing. And many of the patients whom I met through this film are the types who were extremely high-achieving individuals, like my mom, before fibromyalgia became this unexpected visitor that just wouldn't go away. And they were used to performing at very high levels and doing things far more productively than other people would. And so giving up that control is extremely difficult. But surprisingly, it is in giving up that control that somehow we get a semblance of it again. And somebody who's a little bit more knowledgeable in Zen Buddhism or something like that could probably explain that further. But that's sort of an aphorism that I've taken away from learning a little bit more about fibromyalgia. And we definitely need each other. Whether it be the support groups or the family members in our life, we don't do well alone. And fibromyalgia can be an incredibly isolating condition. Linda in the film says that one of the hardest things for her to do is tell her friends that sometimes she's really lonely. And it's not a reflection necessarily on them, but it's just a sort of illness that can isolate you when you can't always keep your commitments to be somewhere, when you sometimes have to be in bed, when you yourself are suffering from the secondary depression that would come from any chronic illness, much less a chronic pain illness. It can be very lonely, and sometimes I think we want to close down. And this was something I saw in my mom for sure during some of the darkest time. And when I say that, it really was years. Because I remember we used to drop our dog off every morning for grandma daycare. Unfortunately, we live now in Northern California. She lives in Southern California, so with the real daycare needs, we're gonna have to arrange something else. But my husband and I would go to work, and we would drop our dog off at my mom's house, and she would watch Polly. She was in the film briefly. For those of you who saw it, she's a slightly bigger dog, and the one that wasn't there all the time. The other one is my mom's dog, Leo. And she was somebody, this was before my mom got her own dog, she was something in my mom's life to take care of, and something that needed her, and something that was completely non-judgmental about how she felt that day. And there were times when my mom was so depressed from the pain that I was worried, honestly, that she might do something final. She might do something to harm herself. And I knew that if Polly was there, my mother would never do anything that would upset Polly, and if it wouldn't upset Polly, it wouldn't upset me. And so in some ways, Polly was our little guardian angel that we left with her sometimes when she really was closed in and isolated. And you hear her talk about in the film that you have to get to a point where you're making decisions that are not driven by pain, where pain is not your every driving thought. And that for people, that's different things. For some people, that might be as much medication as you need that day to get through. For other people, it's going to be a variety of things. For a while, for her, it was a lot of medication. And when she references that, I know that she's talking about some of those dark days when I I know she was looking at train schedules to know when the trains were going by on the tracks and things like that. And when she says you need to make sure that when you are making decisions through pain, that they're not going to be good decisions, and so they probably shouldn't be final ones. She's referencing very final decisions, and it's one of the big dangers when we isolate ourselves, and particularly in a condition like this that's pain. It changes. Constant pain changes a person's personality. And so my need each other is my mom and dad and Leo on the beach in Oceanside. This is down in Oceanside, California. And Leo, I wanted to just mention a little bit more. Some of you might have seen, I wrote an article for the National Fibromyalgia Association a while ago about Leo and my mom. That's her little dog. And just how amazing it has been what he has done for her life. When we eventually needed to move away, I told Stephen, we can't leave. We've got, Polly, we can't take Polly away from my mom. And one day we were out walking Polly in this sort of rural park area in Oceanside, where unfortunately people sometimes dump unwanted dogs. And we saw this little guy, and he didn't look nearly as happy as he looks in this picture. And he was very skittish, and we were used to all the dogs around this area, and he wasn't one we'd ever seen. And I asked a local nursery owner, what's up with this dog? And he said, oh, somebody dumped him last night. I thought the coyotes would get him last night. We have a lot of coyotes down in Southern California. And I said, well, if he'll let me catch him, I'll at least take him to the Humane Society. And he said, yeah, go for it if you can. I've picked up so many dogs over the years that people dump out here that I'm tired of the hassle of doing it. So he wouldn't let Stephen get close to him, but he would let me get close to him. And it was actually something, he had a real fear of men for quite a while, but he was okay with women. And we took him home and filed a report, even though we were sure that nobody was looking for him. And we put him up on a little adoption rescue group website. But the law requires that if you find a dog, you have to keep it for at least 2 weeks, just in case somebody is looking for it. And so during those 2 weeks, we were doing our normal routine where we would drop Polly off at my mom's house on our way to work. So instead of just watching Polly, she was watching Polly and Leo. We called him Leo because we found him in August during Leo, and he also has this like fuzzy lion-looking, Leo the lion sort of look. And I remember telling my mom, why don't you just keep him? She said, no, I can't take on a dog. It was one thing watching Polly, but Polly went home with us at night. And the day that an adoptive family was supposed to come pick him up, the agency had already gone and examined their house and made them make their fence taller and blah, 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 blah. They'd had a visit. I mean, they'd already done all this work. That morning, she calls at 7 o'clock in the morning and says, don't let them take him, I want him. So he managed to love his way right around into her heart. And he wasn't actually very well. He was already about 4 years old, they think. And he wasn't very well housebroken. So it actually was a lot of patience on both my parents' part to get him up to a better standard of behavior. But he has been so amazing for her. And it's just been incredible how he has helped her. And he's much less high energy than my dog. And so my dog needs to get her exercise every day. But this guy, when she's having a bad day, he is perfectly happy to cuddle up on the couch or on the bed for as long as she needs to. He doesn't mind at all. And it has just been, they're completely codependent on each other now. She goes to the bathroom and he lays outside the door they're quite adorable. But having that life for her to take care of and nourish, and then in turn that unconditional love. So not everybody necessarily has to go out and get a dog, but you need to find that something in life that connects you to outside of that. Oops. This is a really, really big thing that I learned. And that's that we must do more to help each other understand that our value is not based on our bodies or our productivity. I especially think that women in this society, learn that their value comes from their body often. And so when your body stops working, you lose any of that value that you associated with that. And the productivity part is, I think, is an especially big part of the fibromyalgia community, because many of the people who I've met with fibromyalgia in the past were extremely successful, highly productive, high-functioning individuals who got a lot of their personal self-worth from being able to do, like my mom, 20 things at once, better than any of us could have done one of those things at once at the same time. And when you lose the ability to do that, you lose that entire identity of how you've come to view yourself as this incredibly productive, efficient, and talented person. And yet, of course, our value never came from that in the first place. We have intrinsic value that's based on who we are as people. You know, the more transcendent qualities of your soul and things like that. But it's very, very difficult to learn that lesson and to readjust that identity. And that's actually one reason why people have asked, for those of you who saw the film, this is often a question I get, why we chose to end the film with my mom still in a wheelchair. The very last frame of the film is my mom in a wheelchair, and she pushes herself over to the open door where there's this shaft of light coming in, and she just puts her arms out and takes a big breath. And it's powerful because she was never the type of person to do that. She has definitely learned to slow down and take life in an entirely different way than she did before. But also because it wasn't until she was wheelchair bound and barely able to take care of herself, where her body truly did completely almost abandon her, that she was able to understand that her value as a person was not defined by her body. And it was a very, very powerful lesson for her to learn and for all of us to learn. And she, in turn, now tells me, honey, you are going to need to slow down, or you are going to end up with fibromyalgia. And then she'll sit and she'll tell me that she went to the healing gardens that day to do some meditation. I'm like, is this the mother I grew up with who would have just scoffed that as some new age hullabaloo when I was a kid? And so it's been amazing to watch her become the teacher to all of us in these ways. And I'm from San Francisco, so I'm used to alternative practices now. But she's the one who often tells me, you just need to go sit by the fountain for a little while and say a prayer or do something. She comes from a Christian background, so when she meditates now, she's worked that into her practice, and she's really learned to be much more flexible and adaptable. And all of that comes back to her learning to identify herself in an entirely new way. And for her, it took a wheelchair and almost a complete breakdown of her body to do that. I hope it isn't for all of us. Things really are changing, and for the better. I have only been involved in fibromyalgia for a few years. Many of you I know have been involved in this for much, much longer than you would like to think about. But things really are changing. When we started this project and told people that we were working on a film about fibromyalgia, we often were met with complete blanks of, the fibro my what. I do remember this one story I like to tell where, this is actually a story on my mother-in-law. We're telling her what we were working on, and she said, "Oh, yeah, I think I had that once." I said, "Oh, no, you didn't. If you can talk about it like that, you sure didn't." But we got a lot of attitudes like that. Or if I was talking to somebody from the medical field, I would often get well, are you going to show the side that talks about the, questions about fibromyalgia? And we don't get that nearly as much anymore. Now, if we ever talk about the project, they've heard about it. Often they have a decent idea of what it is, and they often know somebody, like, oh yeah, my so-and-so has it. And particularly in the medical field, I have a couple friends who are practicing physicians, one who's just a family care doctor and one who's a physiatrist. And they both watched the film and gave us feedback in early stages of it. And it's amazing just to think how much more proactive they are than some of the doctors, for example, that my mom went to. I know the medical establishment can get a bad rap, particularly in patient communities with with something like this for very, very good reasons. But as Dr. Silverman, who's a significant part of our film, talks about, it's really mainly just because doctors went into that business because they want to help people. And fibromyalgia, they don't, just as our culture doesn't understand it, they often don't understand it either. And they get incredibly frustrated if they have to tell you, I don't know. It would be a lot better if they would just sit down with you and say, I don't know, but here, let's go on this journey together, and I'll read a little research, and you try this, and we'll report back in a month and see what's going on. But often, and I've been experiencing this as I've been going through pregnancy, you get like 6 or 7 minutes sometimes. I mean, if we're lucky, we get 6 or 7 minutes with our obstetrician. And I'm a very talkative person. I'm usually like, wait, no, come back. I've still got a question. And with a fibromyalgia patient, I mean, that list of questions can be really legitimately 20 questions long for that visit. And doctors they start thinking of patients as time drainers. And they don't see the results that they want. And so they often just get really frustrated with that. But that is really, truly, honestly changing. At least in many of the circles that I know patients in, doctors would have negative feedback from their peers if they were just to dismiss fibromyalgia like they even did 5 or 10 years ago. I know that's not true in every part of the country, but it is starting to change, and there is a lot more research that's coming out. The National Fibromyalgia Association has a table out there, and I'm sure many of you are already members and get their magazine, but I highly encourage you to sign up for that if you don't. They've been doing a lot of work. It's not official yet, but keep your eye out for some announcements coming out soon. They've really started working on focusing on legislation. So they actually have been in D.C. Working with lobbyists and other groups to get more funding from like the National Institutes of Health for research and education, and I really think that's a great approach. When it starts happening at that level, we're going to start to see changes. And the medicines that have started to come out from the pharmaceuticals. I mentioned this after the screening, but in our culture, we don't believe there's a disease if there's not a drug for it. And so now there are at least 2. It must be legitimate, right? And so there really have been positive changes. And even just the PSAs that they were running that for Lyrica and some of these drugs, a few of which feature some of the people in the film, have been extremely positive. In the evening news, I had people calling all the time saying, oh, I was watching the news and I saw something about that thing you did that project on. So things are changing. There really is reason to hope for that. Whether in the context of fibromyalgia or not, we all do better when we find ways of getting outside of ourselves and our pain. This was something in the film that Lynn Matayana really talked about often, is finding what brings us joy and not always just focusing on what's not working right then. For her, it was doing watercolors. For my mom, it was her gardening. And actually, she has now started volunteering on Wednesdays at a rehab hospital where she ended up having a procedure done. And she goes every Wednesday for a few hours and talks to people who are just fresh out of major back surgery and sort of tells them like the road that they're probably going to be on and what to expect and things like that. And it's really, really amazing how it helps when we can get outside of our own bubble of pain, as legitimate as it is, and focus on somebody else for a while. It's amazing. It's not like the pain isn't there, but just for a while we aren't focusing on it in the same way. And I think this is true. Everybody in our culture could learn a little bit more about getting outside of ourselves to do things for other people more often. Probably the biggest lesson I took away is that fibromyalgia patients are seriously heroes. They are courageous and strong, and they have to deal with things that most people just have no idea the sort of stamina that it takes to get through. The more we interviewed people for this project, I told Stephen, the more nervous I got because I just started feeling the responsibility of all of these amazing people who had opened up themselves to us. I was like, Stephen, it has to be good. We can't disappoint them. They're trusting us to tell their story. And so I have a picture here of the premiere down in Los Angeles with most of the participants in the film. And I thought I'd give you a little more of an update of how they're doing. The film gives an update at the end, but as I said, we finished that in late 2006, so things have changed even a little bit. If you start on your, let's see, that's your far right. Ooh, sorry. The beautiful blonde, Lauren. She was, at the end of 2006, Deputy Director for Homeland Security in Los Angeles, and she's now Director for Homeland Security in Los Angeles. For those of you who saw the film, she's the crazy kickboxing one who you would never think is in pain. And but she was really like Olympic-level athletic material before she got fibromyalgia. So for her, what she can do now is quite diminished from what she'd had visions of herself. I think I feel better, though, knowing that Lauren is out there holding the front lines for us. She's also gotten married, and she's thinking about starting a family. And I was really glad to hear this. It's something that didn't make it into the film. We had over 40 hours of footage, but she had talked about maybe never wanting to get married and have children because if there was a genetic component, she wouldn't want to pass that on. And so it's really encouraging for me to see her in a more positive place now. And she also, and she said I could share this with you, started taking a very low-grade antidepressant, and she said she hadn't realized how depressed she had gotten being in pain all the time. And that really made a big difference for her. My mom, I'll come back to because I have another slide just for her. She's the one standing next to Lauren. Of course, there's me and Stephen. Everybody can see our big news that's on the way. Frances, the one who she is the model for the 40th anniversary Black Barbie. The gorgeous one standing there is still acting and modeling in Los Angeles, and still has pain, but still finds the children in her life and her family to be her motivations. Dr. Gillespie, who is the neuropsychologist who is in the film, is no longer practicing at the Cedars-Sinai Rehabilitation Center, but he's actually moved to the Inland Empire in the Loma Linda Riverside area where he is still practicing with patients. Randy is still helping the National Fibromyalgia Association at every corner. He still does drag racing in his car. It's this great, I just love the juxtaposition of his drag racing car with National Fibromyalgia Association on the side of it. So, and I know he just participated, they did a walk this year for Fibromyalgia Awareness Day, and I know he participated in that. Lynn is still the president of the National Fibromyalgia Association, and they're growing and expanding, and like I mentioned, really focusing on legislation now and finding a lot of success through there. Sadly, one of her dogs that was in the film passed away since the end of that film, but she's still lavishing love on the other one. Linda is still having a lot of pain and isn't able to bike even as much as she was able to when we were shooting the film, but she still walks and meditates and still finds a lot of joy in that. And Richard, who is Lynn's husband, is still like superhero supportive husband in my book. He's really amazing. And the one person who's not pictured here is Liana. She is the Stanford medical student who has fibromyalgia, the flowing, long, gorgeous red hair that I was always completely jealous of. She has not only gotten married, but she has a little girl now. And so she said she actually, and I know this I've heard this from many people, she had almost complete relief from all of her symptoms during pregnancy and for about 8 months postpartum, but then they came back after that. So she says it's hard. She actually did finish medical school, so she is now an MD from Stanford. She's postponing her residency and some things like that until her daughter's a little bit older. She didn't want to take on having an infant and all of that and fibromyalgia at the same time. And she says she still finds some of her best relief through acupuncture. That's one of her. She actually, something that didn't make it into the film was both of her parents are doctors in the very traditional Western sense of doctor, and they had a really hard time with her diagnosis because they were sort of the school of, well, just buck up and get over it. But so watching their daughter go through this has been extremely profound for them. And she said it's really hilarious to hear her parents, who used to be completely against anything like chiropractic or acupuncture or anything like that, call when she's having a bad day. And it's like, well, maybe you should make an appointment with a chiropractor. And her mother actually helps train residents, and now make sure that they actually have some education on fibromyalgia as part of their program. And so that's just fantastic news. So yeah, she, if possible, her smile is even bigger than it was then with her little girl. And my mom, if you'll see here, recently finished a 10K in Hawaii. Yes. This was in June of this year. And for those of you guys who saw the film, it was June 10, 1997. That was the fall that she had, that it was sort of the most defining moment that we can pinpoint for her real decline in health. And so this was almost 11 years to the day after that event. And she'll point out that the 12-year-old kid who was doing the half marathon finished ahead of her, but but she did it. She was slow and steady, wins the day. And let me tell you, it was hot out there. I was really glad to be pregnant so that I didn't have to have the urge to maybe participate. I was really impressed, and she was so proud of herself and so thrilled. She still has some flares. In fact, this was a crazy travel arrangement, the most horrible trip to Hawaii we've ever taken. Going from California to Hawaii, we had to go via Phoenix. And so after this race, she actually had an all-night flight to Honolulu and then to Phoenix and then San Diego in coach. I mean, you can just imagine how she was feeling at the end of this. So she really did have almost 5 weeks recovering from this particular event. But it was worth it to get a little bit of that sense of that back. And she wanted to do the Honolulu Marathon, but she's settling right now for the Kona 10K, where she and my dad really they were amazing. So very proud. And my final lesson that I learned from fibromyalgia, and this is the shot at the end of the film of my mom in her wheelchair, sort of opening herself up to the light there. Is this Emily Dickinson poem that I ended the film with. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all.